So we're turning to a new text that's Rousseau's Social Contract. And I think it would be possible for you to think, this is very repetitive. We're just doing, once again, Hobbes and Locke. We're doing social contract thinking. So I want to reorient your thought process, your mind, your consciousness, so that you're receptive to the idea Rousseau's approach to these problems and what he conceives of the problem is radically different from Locke and Hobbes. Radically different. He's offering a radically different understanding of the relationship between the human being and society. And that different orientation, that different way of thinking about the relationship of man and woman to society is a really new contribution to political philosophy. So in spite of the fact that the language of the social contract seems like it's kind of like repeating Locke, or maybe even repeating Hobbes. So Hobbes was 1620. I'm not very good at dates, but Hobbes was early 17th century. Locke was 75 years later. This book was written in 1762. Was there a big event in France in the 18th century that you're aware of? Big event. Yeah, the French Revolution. And anybody know the date of the French Revolution? July 4th. Nice try, but not exactly right. 1789 is the date of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution shook Europe to its foundation. People all over the landmass, from Great Britain to Turkey, paid attention to the earthquake that occurred at the time of the French Revolution. I bet that we don't have a tremendous amount of collective knowledge, but we have some collective knowledge in this group of why that would be. Why is the French Revolution such a big deal? Anybody want to offer some theories?
Well, it was kind of like the first time that the public rose against the monarchy and not only overthrew them, but killed a lot of them, if not all of them. And so there was kind of this fear of, well, is my country next? Are the masses going to rise up against me now? And so it was kind of, and especially following on the coattails of America declaring independence, and kind of that idea of sedition was running around in the back of people's minds.
Okay, so an uprising of common people, ordinary people, against the received order, against the monarchy, against the state. The Great English Revolution was in 1660 or something like that. And it was a revolution also, but it was more of an elite revolution. So you're right that the French Revolution was different in this important respect, that it was underclass people revolting against the status quo, against the king, against the aristocracy. And it's fascinating to read the history of the French Revolution. One or two of you may have an interest in, well, when I was in graduate school, I read a book by Albert Soboul, who was, I think he's probably deceased by now, a French, somewhat Marxist historian of the French Revolution. And I remember having this thought when I was a graduate student. I read the book and I thought, if I ever have a son or daughter, this is the first book I'm going to ask them to read. It's kind of, before Goodnight Moon, before, I don't know, all those other childhood classics. I wanted them to read Albert Soboul's History of the French Revolution. It's an inspiring book, a really fascinating book, but not necessarily a correct book, a true book. It would be such an interesting thing if we took a little diversion in this course. We spent 2 weeks reading a couple of different histories of the French Revolution, because it really is a turning point in world history. There's a joke made by, I think it was Chow En Lai in 1979. 1989. This in China. Zhou Enlai was Chinese leader. I'm probably messing this story up completely, but in 1989, an important Chinese leader, of course, you remember 1949 was the Chinese Revolution, and a lot of the language which was used by Chinese revolutionaries was, well, Marxist, but also French revolutionist. So some of the metaphors and images of the French Revolution. Anyway, Zhou Enlai was asked, 200 years, what do you now make of the French Revolution? What is the meaning and significance of the French Revolution? And his response was, it's too early to tell. Isn't that a curious response? We're dealing in history here. What do you think he might have meant by that? Amber, give it a thought.
Such a big event that the effects would extend past 200 years.
Yeah, that's a real good thought. Who else might have a thought? Ethan, do you have a thought about this?
I was thinking that not only did the French last so long, but they started in France, they spread out to
Okay,
they're still.
so the ripples continue.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting thought also. So they're compatible, these two observations. Anybody else have a thought? Chinese Revolution. People often group three great revolutions. The US Revolution doesn't come into it, by the way. But the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution is the great revolutions of the 18th, 19th, to 20th centuries. And why does revolution seem like such an important historical moment? And then if it is indeed Zhou Enlai, it might be another major Chinese leader who said this. The beauty of Google is you can figure it out really quickly. It's too early to tell. Famous Chinese leader, you can tell me who it was. But it's kind of relevant for us. It's the interesting thing. Because here in the honors program, we're actually dealing with, you read Marc Bloch. A few of you read Marc Bloch in the 4 Trials course with me. And Marc Bloch's approach to history is that history is never complete, that we never know exactly what January 6th, 2021 meant. We know some of what it meant, but we don't know what its further ramifications are. 200 years is a very long time, and yet Zhou Enlai was basically saying there are still ramifications. There are still parts of the French Revolution we don't understand. And that historical research, honest historical research is needed in order to better understand it. There's a figure, Simon Schama, that if you ever watch public television, you sometimes see Simon Schama on television because he also wrote a history of Great Britain. And he's kind of a puffed up academic. He's very full of himself, I think. But he wrote a book called Citizens, which is a history of the French Revolution. And his take is there was no such, now get ready for this. Anybody who falls, I'm not liable for you falling off your chair because I tell you something startling. His assertion is there was no French Revolution. How could an intelligent historian say such a crazy thing? Anybody have a thought about that? Amber, do you have a thought about that? How can an historian say there was no French Revolution? What do you think?
Because the French Revolution was a revolution that wasn't like they fought and then at the end they achieved what they were before. It was a long period of time where they were continually fighting.
Brilliant.
One fight over another.
So that's a very nice interpretation of what he might have meant, and I think that is probably a part of what he meant. If I were paraphrasing, I would say we have certain understandings, semantic, meaningful understandings of what a revolution is. It has a beginning and an end. It's kind of coherent. It's like the Battle of Normandy. Once you've got the five armies, I'm holding up 4 fingers. The invasion had a beginning and an end. And so the French Revolution must be kind of like that. It had a beginning and an end. You can tell the story. And so your point, I'm kind of paraphrasing your point. I don't know if you even see the similarity, maybe not, maybe I'm stretching a little bit, but is that when we say the French Revolution, we bring along with us, that kind of envelope of thinking it's a discrete historical event with a certain amount of coherence and a beginning and an end. Chao and Lai and Shama are both challenging that idea. Chao and Lai by saying it doesn't have an end because we don't know exactly how it ended. We don't know how the Liberte, Egalite, Fraternite, how that revolution of political thought will end. So it's not over yet. That's one way of reading Chao and Lai. And what Shama has in mind is kind of different from that. His view is we have a lot of, it's kind of like the beginning of my book about evil that you read right at the beginning of the semester, where I say, what do we know about the Holocaust? And I list a series of facts. Do you remember reading that such a long time ago? It seems like, senior year of high school probably read that, but no, it was the beginning of this semester. And I say, we have limited knowledge about the Holocaust. And a lot of what we think we know about the Holocaust is incorrect. That's kind of Shama's view of the French Revolution. Storming the Bastille. What was storming the Bastille? Do you know what that is? What was that event? What is the Bastille? It's a prison, right? It was storming a prison, releasing a bunch of prisoners. Was it in this class or my other class where I asked what a sans-culotte was? Did somebody explain to me in this class? Might have been my other class, the class I teach in Ann Arbor. The sans-culottes, they were referred to as sans-culottes, and they were lower class, underclass, artisan workers of Paris who stormed the prison and emancipated the prisoners. Anybody speak French in the room? Nobody studied French in high school. That's too bad. My wife will be deeply disappointed. She is French and a professor of French, and she feels enough people do not study French. It means without culottes, except the student who explained it to me was without underwear. That's not what I understood. Anyway, too poor to have socks or underwear. That's who stormed. So that's one of the images we have of the French Revolution. There's a famous painting that we probably have in mind of Liberte wearing a long white gown, leading a bunch of armed troops, overthrowing the ancien regime, the old regime. And what do you suppose the old regime refers to? Is it just old people? Old people got overthrown? No. What do you think a regime is? Let's do a little interpretation of what is it to overthrow the old regime? Sienna, I'm putting you on the spot. What is it? I come in the room and I say, good news. The old regime is dead. Long live the new regime. What am I referring to? What is a regime?
I think that maybe what you mean or what you mean probably one of the last forms of government before, but I also feel like regime needs something different than just saying that they the last government or the government that
Yeah, you're right. It's bigger than government. It's not just removing the government. It's removing the whole social order. It's removing the idea that aristocrats own the land and peasants are their subjects. Feudalism, of course, was done. It was already done. But servility, is that word familiar? To be servile? Servility? What does that mean to you? Servility. I live a life of quiet servility. Mean anything to you at all? It's got a quick interpretation. Lovely. It's a good question for you to ask. So Morgan, you're on the spot. Servility, or to be servile, if that makes it. Okay, well maybe it's just it's a word that isn't that familiar to you then. Servility is a relationship of weak, deferential respect. So the Lord comes in. It would be as if in the university, the dean had all the power and the professors were servile. To be servile is to be a servant. So if the dean were to come in the room and I were then to, kind of be nodding and bowing, take up my hat and say, please come and have a seat. Let me send Daniel to get you some tea. And would somebody else get him a nice biscuit? And what can we do for you? I'm acting out being servile. What does that have to do with French society? Give it a thought. Javed, take it from there.
I suppose French society prior to the revolution would have been servile, deference to the ruling class at the time.
Yes.
So the revolution was about, overthrowing the regime was about getting rid of that servile.
Exactly. Exactly. And ruling class is actually a complicated notion. But I refer to aristocracy, landed aristocracy. So the landowner and then the farmers. How do we think about a farmer? In this country, we think of a farmer as the technical term would be landowning peasant. So the farm in my own personal family belonged to a particular family. It was farmed by the farmer and his wife and sons. And the produce then was their property and they sold the produce. They were sometimes exploited. We could talk about the exploitation of farming by big grain companies, which maintain the price of grain. In other words, we could tell a little story about oppression and power in American family farming. Is that how French farming worked in 1750, do you suppose? And you can tell from my tone of voice, no, not at all. That's not the model of agriculture in France, but rather it was kind of post-feudalism, but not very post. The relationship between the large landowner and the tenant farmer was a very exploitative relationship. And I don't mean in the Marxist sense. It was extractive. It was an extractive relationship. But is servility, what I was mocking a few minutes ago, is that an economic relationship, do you think? What do you think, Ethan? Am I displaying my economic weakness when I bow to the dean and I offer him tea and so forth? Is that about economic power or is that something else?
It's more of just like a lifestyle thing. You just kind of exploit every aspect of it.
Okay, so it's bigger than economic. It's social. It's an inequality of station and status. The Lord is the Lord. What does it mean on TV when they talk about upstairs, downstairs? It's a TV show that was on before you got PBS, before you were born. But the modern equivalent is, what's the one about the big mansion and all these aristocrats and then all the servants and what is that called? It was on TV for a long time. Downton Abbey, exactly. Relationship between the aristocrats of Downton Abbey and the servants. How would you characterize that relationship? One of equality and respect.
Servants and serve.
Servants and lords and masters. If you read Dostoevsky, who's read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy about serfdom or Chekhov? I think these are wonderful pieces of literature which teach us a lot about different social orders. But Dead Souls, that's Gogol, I think, the Russian writer. It's a fascinating story. It's a crazy story, actually. Dead Souls. So the landowner owns 600 serfs, and they're referred to as souls. So he's a big landowner. He owns 600 souls. And a kind of con man, seeming aristocrat, shows up at his home one day. It says, I'm just wondering, have any of your serfs died recently? He said, well, I don't really know. My master of serfs has to keep track of that. Well, find out for me. I'm interested in whether you have any dead souls. This is Gogol, the amazingly brilliant Russian short storyist, right at the end of serfdom. And so it turns out there were 20 or 30 people who unfortunately passed away, may their souls live on, etc. Russian Orthodox Church, the bells tolled, etc. But they hadn't been registered with the census authorities yet. And so this new person in town says, I would like to buy those souls. I would like to buy their records. And as the story goes on, it emerges he's building up his own serf colony of people who are dead for some nefarious financial purpose. Anyway, the point is, what Gogol is describing is a social order of lord and master and serf. Complete servility. Servility, maybe the best definition would have been, servility is the condition of being a serf. You know what are the obligations of a serf? Do you know that from European history? Being a serf? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, for services, like they kind of like had to like own and take care of land, but they didn't really own it. It was their lords, so they're kind of like servants to them.
Yeah, they had to farm the land. They were attached to the land. That's why the landlord said, I have 600 serfs, 600 souls, and they are attached to my farm. I don't think they called it a farm. My manor, that was the medieval term, a manor. So there's 600 of these individuals, and they're my serfs. They're my serfs. They belong to me. What are their obligations? Well, one is that they can't go away. Did you ever hear the medieval term, the medieval phrase, town air makes a man free? Did you ever hear that phrase? It's a piece of medieval history. What do you think it means? Take a guess. Town air makes a man free. Yeah. And it was actually a matter of law that if you found yourself in Bruges, which I think is in the Netherlands, if you were a serf who made it to Bruges, you were no longer a serf. You were emancipated. Your master could no longer come and take you back. So town air actually did make a man free, man and his family possibly. Any residents here, by the way? Anything you know about American history? What I'm describing, serfdom, sounds a lot like American slavery, but not identical with American slavery. So I'm still riffing on servility. And how do the serfs relate to the master? How does the master relate to the serf? And yeah, Ethan, are you, you're just fixing your hair, or are you offering a comment?
Well, the biggest connection I could make was the serfs escaping to the town was a lot like Canada.
Yes, it is like that, except that the jurisdiction had to be another country,
Right.
Because in the United States, there were laws about returning escaped slaves. Evidently, on the Underground Railroad, there were stations along HONS Drive. I learned that fairly recently. Secret stations for escaping slaves on their way to Canada. Of course, HONS Drive is pretty close to Canada, except when there are truckers making it impossible to cross the river. But otherwise, it's pretty close to Canada. So what I'm working here in your mind is a different social world, a different social order. Pre-revolution Europe, feudalism. And then the successor to feudalism, which was still a very sharply divided scheme of status and power. Aristocrats, landed aristocrats, royal types who had certain rights with regard to aristocrats, But with in fact, the French Revolution actually happened not because a bunch of people with no underwear attacked a prison. I still find it kind of was chuckling about a little bit, but no, it wasn't that social uprising that occurred. It was a fiscal conflict between the lords and the king. The king wanted more taxes, and the third estate, the lords, said, we're done with your taxes. We're not interested in any more taxes. Go fishing or something. So there was a standoff between the aristocrat class. The idea of an estate was a legally defined class of people. Did peasants come into that at all? Not a bit. The aristocrats, they didn't own the farmers anymore, but they had complete dominion over the farmers. They had dominion in the sense that they, I mean, really kind of horrible things. They could beat them as they wished. They could sexually exploit them. They could change rents unilaterally. So peasants or farmers or people of the agricultural class, it's almost like a science fiction story. These crazy social distinctions that were heavily binding. The French Revolution brought an end to that system. The French Revolution, what was the word I was looking for a little while ago? It was the ancien regime. The ancien regime, the old regime, was the system of social power and economic extraction. What was the primary source of wealth in France, you think, in the year 1700 or 1650? It was agriculture, it was farming. So being a landowner was to be situated in exactly the right place to capture a lot of the wealth of France. You were going to make a point, yes.
Yeah, I think just to speak to like how I know about this is just in ninth grade when we were learning about it, my teacher made us play a game to like model that. So like a random few people were given the lordship, and so we would spend the entire hour just trying to get as many crops as possible. And so we ended up with like hundreds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then by the end of class, only one action was taken by those elected to be lords, and all of our work for that hour was lost. So I guess that just showed to how much, like these people went through, and then still they lost everything. And so it just speaks to how necessary it was for the French to, make it stop pretty much.
Well, for which French? The aristocrats didn't want to
Not
make it.
Of course, yeah.
For poor people, ordinary people, the 80%. I don't know actually what the numbers are, but urbanization in 17th century France was probably, I don't know, between 5 and 10% maybe. So cities, jumbo, super duper large cities like Paris might be 100,000 people or 200,000 people, as opposed to 1 million people today. Are you online? Can you see if Paris 1800, what the population of Paris 1800? Oh, well, forget it. I thought you were on easily. You're on. Okay, you can. I don't mean to interrupt our line of thought here, but it is kind of important to understand what changed during the French Revolution. How do you think peasants? Well, I'm remembering a Vietnamese proverb about taxation and rent. What are the things which determine quality of life if you're a farmer in Vietnam in 1920? What do you suppose determines your life? You're a farmer, so you grow. What do they grow in Vietnam, do you think? Rice, I suppose. That's probably the main crop. So you're a rice farmer. Weather is a major determinant. Rents are a second determinant. And taxes are the third determinant. And rents are often share rents, so that the landowner expropriates or demands as a rent some share, let's say 50%. Much better than you peasants in your ninth grade who had to give everything. Yeah, go ahead. 550,000, so a little bigger than I was thinking. But the total urbanization of France in 1700, I'm still willing to kind of guess it was, let's say 10 to 15%, very low. China only passed the 50% mark a few years ago, being more than 50% rural up through, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. So most people were agricultural. Anybody here want to say, I would love to be a farmer, especially a farmer of rice in 1920 in Vietnam? Great life. I'm for it. Sienna, how you feel about it? You ready to go for, it's science fiction here. We've got ships going to various places. Are you willing to get on the rice farming in Vietnam-like planet ship? Mitchell, are you ready for the ship that is going to aristocrat living off the proceeds of his 1,000-acre manor with 100 souls associated, 100 serfs? You're going to feudalism planet, but you've also got a special ticket that's engraved in gold. You get to be an aristocrat. You get to be a serf lord. Just quality of life. Morally, none of us wants to be a serf manager, I don't think. But quality of life, which is better? 1920s independent farmer with taxes and rent, or serf master with 1,000 souls generating a whole lot of agricultural product and also stuff to use. So a medieval manor, I've got a nice picture on my blog of a medieval manor, a bunch of artisans who do nice things like make silverware and ceramics. And so it's a pretty nice life. What's another term for the life of that 1920s Vietnamese farmer? Are there any descriptive terms that you might use? Servility is the one we started out with. Do you think that the peasant farmer and the landlord who lives in the city in Vietnam, I realize you don't think, Evans, I don't know anything about Vietnam either because I was not drafted in 1969 or 1970. But I've read a lot about Vietnam. Absentee landlord, farmer with a fixed rent of, let's say, 50% of the product. What kind of life do you call it? Servility is one word we've introduced. What other words might we introduce here? Sienna, does it seem fair that landlord living in, I don't know, anybody think of a Hue? I think that's in North Vietnam. I think there was a bunch of bombing in Hue in the Vietnam War. Landlord lives in comfort in the town and just shows up to take the product, like your teacher. What do you call that kind of relationship? It's just a fair exchange of services and benefits, or what do you call it? Tyranny, that's a possibility. I heard somebody else.
It sounds like a parasite, like you work so
Parasite,
hard to do stuff and then it just
not bad. Parasite, exploitation might be, in the kind of technical sense, not the Marxist sense, but the technical sense, the landlord is exploiting the peasant's life by putting him and his family in a situation where their only choice is to work 14 hours a day in water infested with, by the way, parasites, real parasites that suck your blood, etc. They're kind of nasty kind of parasites. Did you see the scene in The African Queen, the Bogie movie? Did you ever see that movie, African Queen? Bogart is a drunken captain of a boat, and they're trying to escape in Africa. But anyway, he has to get out and pull the boat, and a bunch of bloodsuckers get on him. It turns out he's completely neurotically afraid of bloodsuckers. So what do you call them? They're not called leeches. Leeches. He's afraid of leeches. So he goes kind of berserk. See the movie. It's a good movie, I guess. But anyway, exploitation. Now I want to move one step further. How about these peasants? Are they just kind of dumb? Do they just live with this exploitation? My father was exploited, my children will be exploited. We're treated like we're imbeciles. We have to doff our cap. We have to take our little cookies. We only have 6 cookies for 12 children, and we have to give 3 of them to the landlord when he comes to visit. How would a normal person react to that situation? I'm asking you to, it's a little like the game that your teacher was asking you to play. How would human beings react to situations like that? That's the way it is, man. It's just, that's the regime. It's the ancien regime. It's how it is here in France in 1750 or Vietnam in 1920. Times will change, but for right now, it's just, that's my life.
Probably
Not livid, okay, possibly angry at the landlord. Yeah, go ahead.
I would argue that maybe they wouldn't be okay with it, but I could see some empathy of some peasants in that situation feeling like they can't do anything about it.
Okay,
I don't think it would be right to completely put that up the table. Like they're not happy about it, but they're like, well, what can I do about it?
right. Okay. Okay, good, yes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was gonna say. When there's like kind of like a barrier so tall. Which is the time and effort, like emotion, trying to think about or complain about how high it is, or we just build your little house at the bottom of the barrier and try to make the best of what you have.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe it's not necessarily like complacency, because I mean, obviously when he ended the chance there was still some sort of revolution, whether it was actually due to the peasants or not. But I think, yeah, like, I'm not sure if everyone was so mad about it. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff going on in our country now, but obviously you don't see every single person.
So that's really astute. You're both making a very, very good point. Because what I was kind of stimulating you to is, wouldn't you think that some level of resistance would emerge? Personal resistance and then maybe collective resistance. And you're both making the point. The final line of the Communist Manifesto is a lie. And the final line, I don't think you've read it. I think we're going to read it here. We may or may not. I can't remember if I signed it. But it is, working men of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Why do you think I would call that a lie? Why would the two of you call it a lie? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess because they have everything to lose.
Mhm.
Even if their wages are terrible, they still have
Yes.
families to support, houses to keep, so
Exactly.
even though to the aristocrats would probably like, it doesn't seem like a lot of that, but it's everything to the people.
Exactly. So you're totally right. I bet that you would
Yeah,
say
I was
something
thinking
similar.
sentiment.
Yeah. So actually being severely exploited and being in a condition of humiliating servility. Let me ask you that question. Do you think that as an ordinary human being, I guess I don't mean the human being you are currently, because if you were forced to live as a serf today, you would find it unbearably humiliating to be bowing and scraping, to live under Jim Crow rules. If you were today an African-American man or woman, would be unbearable. Because we have come to think differently about how human beings should be treated. And to be treated with the idea, for example, if a white person is walking on the sidewalk, you have to step into the mud to let that person walk by, and then you can come back on the sidewalk. You have to keep your head down, you have to not, I mean, the whole script of how to behave if you're an African-American young man or possibly an African-American young woman. We would look at that also as a demand for servility and humiliation. And when you read accounts of people who lived under Jim Crow, it's not that it was acceptable treatment, it's that there was a lot to lose. that refusing could lead to unlimited violence, including death and lynching. So anyway, the point I'm getting at is that servility, exploitation, and a social order that creates this distinction between aristocrats, middle level, somewhat affluent townspeople, and then very poor, disadvantaged rural people. That regime is one that is clearly not, well, what is it not? It's not very good for the people at the bottom. It's not very subjectively good for them. Am I right? Maybe I'm not right about that. Subjectively, what do I mean by that? I mean, they're not going to be very happy in their circumstance. Is that true or not, though? Maybe it's not true. A poor peasant, but there's bread on the table. Did you ever see the Steinbeck movie Grapes of Wrath with Peter Fonda? Fantastic movie. The Tom Joad family. So Tom Joad is the resistant. But it's actually kind of relevant to our thing. Tom Joad's family is not deeply unhappy. They're deeply exploited. They're pushed off their land. There's a great scene, I remember this from so many years ago, where a banker pulls up in a big black car. And he's got a foreclosure eviction notice. He gets out of his car, and Walter Brennan, do you know that actor, Walter Brennan? He was kind of a character actor, but he was on Gunsmoke. He was the limping guy on Gunsmoke. He was in a few Bowie movies. Anyway, he plays an elderly uncle or something in the Joad household. But he has this wonderful soliloquy where he takes a piece of paper and he says, my father was born in this house. I was born in this house. My son was born in this house. I reject your paper. He throws it over the house. It's really a powerful moment. Does it prevent the eviction? No, by the next morning, they're gone. So the power relations that they live in are completely binded. That said, the Joad family is not fundamentally unhappy all the time. So maybe I'm wrong in saying that servility and exploitation leads naturally to resistance and unbearable unhappiness. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But it certainly is a promising location for mobilization. Now, flash forward. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I think for France in particular, it was because there was such like a huge difference between the aristocrats and the poor that they felt that they had such an unfair, like,
Great.
part.
So unfairness, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because you might say it's not the absolute level of one's misery, but it's the idea that it is unfair, that it's the result of unfair behavior on other people's part. The landlord, in fact, a very powerful theory of underclass rebellion and resistance is called the moral economy of the crowd. The moral economy of the crowd. And then it was applied to Vietnam by a person whose work I really admire, James Scott, where he wrote a book called The Moral Economy of the Peasant in Vietnam. But his basic point is Mitchell's point. It is that peasants are led to organized resistance of some kind, not necessarily violent resistance, but resistance of some kind, like going on a rent strike, let's say. They're stimulated when they feel that they have been treated unfairly and unjustly. So fairness and being treated appropriately within the regime in which we live, that's an important determinant of whether people feel aggrieved enough to resist, or on the other hand, I think several of you said, when times are tough, the Tom Joad family just buckles down. I mean, you didn't say it, I said it about Tom Joad. But do you remember that speech? It wound up in Bruce Springsteen's song, Tom Joad. Do you remember the speech? Where the mother is saying to Tom Joad, who's about to go off after having been attacked by a policeman. You're going to get killed doing this. And he says, wherever there's a man, wherever there's a policeman beating a man, I'll be there. Is that a speech you remember? It's worth playing, except YouTube will censor it. Because I've tried playing stuff from YouTube, from movies, and as soon as the recording from our session goes up, it says, copyrighted material, can't post this recording. So you just have to look for it. The Tom Joad, well, I don't have to put it on the recording actually, but anyway, it's a powerful sequence, but it's, and then the mother, Mrs. Joad, Mama Joad, says, Tom, I just don't understand what you're talking about. Because he has this kind of spiritual idea that even if he's killed by the cops, he'll be in everything. He'll be in every struggle. Wherever there's a cop beating a guy, I'll be there. Wherever there's a hungry child, I'll be there. That's what he says. And she doesn't get that at all, which probably everybody watching also doesn't get. But and then he kind of scratches his head and he says, well, I don't get it either. It's just something I've been thinking about, but it's a good scene. It's easy to find on YouTube. But let's move forward to the 1930s in Vietnam, where the Great Depression has led to global price problems, global depression, including agricultural prices. So peasant farmers in China, in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, and of course in Europe and the United States have been badly hurt. In that setting, an organization called the Viet Minh came forward, and it was an organization, not a communist organization to start, but a radical organization, which undertook to mobilize peasant farmers in Vietnam to be prepared to resist who? Well, gosh, do you know who was in charge in Vietnam in the 1930s and 40s? Well, it was France. Vietnam was, Indochina was a French colonial possession. There's some great pictures of downtown Hanoi. I don't know if they called it downtown, but central city Hanoi, these beautiful French buildings and French cars. So the French colonial administration administered Indochina, including Vietnam. But in the countryside, it was pretty much the kind of regime that I was talking about, landowners and rents and taxes and so forth. And the Viet Minh became a dissident organization, a resistant organization, which eventually became a communist organization in the 1950s. Anybody know how the Indochina War came out? Not the US-Vietnam War, but the French war in Indochina. Dien Bien Phu, ever hear of Dien Bien Phu? They did, exactly. The French went to war. Say it again. Exactly. And Dien Bien Phu turned out to be a decisive battle, which the French poured more and more resources into, and the Vietnamese put more and more artillery and troops and so forth. And eventually the French were defeated and left Indochina completely in the 1950s, which led to the US involvement in Vietnam. It's kind of a crazy story. But anyway, the point is, the Viet Minh as a political organization was a grassroots organization with kind of national presence. And their work was to basically mobilize peasant farmers to say servility and exploitation are not the natural condition for you. We can change this social order. We can reverse the social order. Well, did that ever happen in the world before? Yeah, it happened. The person who actually invented this idea, the moral economy of the peasant, is E.P. Thompson, who wrote a book called The Making of the English Working Class. And his, again, it's an incredibly great book. But what he documents is the series of wide protests that happened in English agriculture against excessive rents and against taxation. So there were grain riots, tax riots, local uprisings about exploitation and domination. And what he argues, what E.P. Thompson argues, is this is a classic article, but actually you could have read it in this class. I guess it's not highly relevant, but it's called The Moral Economy of the Crowd. And it's an article, not a long book, so it's something feasible length. But what he argues is that what stimulated a riot was not absolute level of suffering, but it was a perceived unfair action or policy by the aristocracy or by the power, what we might call today the power elite or the tax collectors or whatever. The basic idea was that the conventional morality for the peasant was rents are okay, we'll pay you rents, taxes are okay, we'll pay you taxes, but when there is weather catastrophe and a poor harvest, we expect moderation of rent and moderation of taxes. That's only fair. We're getting less, you should get less. It wasn't articulated as a contract, but it's a little bit like a kind of tacit social contract. If disaster has affected agriculture, then our rents should be reduced and our taxes should be reduced. And what E.B. Thompson argues is that riots occurred in the 1600s in many different parts of England, largely stimulated by failures of local elites to honor this traditional obligation that they had to pay attention to the welfare of the poor, to the welfare of the peasants. And if they were basically saying, nope, your rent is what it is, so deliver it or you'll be expelled and beaten, likewise taxes, if that was the position they took, then riots would occur. Not necessarily highly organized riots or successful riots, but they would, like burn tax offices or threaten. E.P. Thompson also wrote a book that is very relevant to the university, I think, because it's about anonymous threatening letters that were sent in the 17th century. It's called, there was legislation called the Black Acts, but because the legislator's name is Black. And it was to prohibit people from being anonymous and wearing masks. And what E.P. Thompson documents, what's kind of amusing about it is the content of these I'm going to read you one of them. Let's see how I can do that without messing up the recording. I can remove the share, is that what you said? I could do that, yeah. And now I can find what I'm looking for. I played this little clip in my class yesterday. Beautiful. Is it relevant? It's relevant about social conflict. So. I offered that as an example of the very powerful commitment which Dr. King had. Did you notice something about that clip? This was not a prepared oration with the slow cadence of a preacher. This was really from the heart what he was doing. The speaker right before him, the events which occurred in that scene, it was a group of trucks who were passing through Alabama, Mississippi on a kind of a freedom demonstration. And they had been ambushed by Ku Klux Klan types with shotguns. No one was killed, but they were threatened. And then Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power advocate, was also on the truck. he stood up and gave a fiery speech demanding violent retribution against the men with shotguns. And this was Dr. King's response. And what is very powerful to me, I just wonder how it comes across to you. What is very powerful to me is that he, the reason I showed it in my class last night is that we were talking also about collective action around civil rights. And various people made the point that in a way, we've changed the narrative about the civil rights period. We've made it kind of a story about just progress step after step, and everything has kind of worked out well. And it isn't true. But one of the points that was made is that Dr. King has been kind of transformed into a very bland advocate for can't we just all get along? And I offered this as kind of an alternative, a very powerful voice for a particular strategy, a nonviolent strategy of demanding progress on civil rights and demanding it through mass action rather than through violent action. Anyway, it wasn't completely relevant, but since it was on the screen, I did show it to you. This is going to be a little, I just wish we had like all day together. There's so many interesting things to share. This is Gloria House, Professor Gloria House, used to be on the faculty here, and a civil rights leader and advocate I really admired. But what I'm looking for is Thompson, E.P. Thompson on the Black Acts. That's the making of the English working class. That's the moral economy we've just been talking about. Tony Joad, you've heard of. Well, heck. The Black Act turned out to be too common a search term. So I'm going to look for anonymous. What's that? Where was that? Oh, I see. Now I guess, yeah. This is probably not really worth, there's an awful lot of posting I've done about the civil rights movement also. You're probably wondering, what does today's conversation have to do with Rousseau? And it has a deep connection, because what, I don't know, maybe I should turn to that rather than looking for these anonymous notes, which are barely literate, but are very, very contrary to servility. Servility, the peasant bowing and scraping, taking his hat off and saying, your master, anything you want, your master. These notes are, if you show your blasted face around my farm again, I'll kill you with an axe, I will indeed. They're kind of like that, but they're anonymous. What's the point of being anonymous? It is, you will not be arrested and punished for making threats against your landlord. So the Black Acts made it a crime to leave anonymous letters. Sounded all familiar to social media? What is the term that's used when you're hassling a person on social media? What do you call that? Trolling? Yeah, these guys, I think they were men, were basically trolling their masters, not in the direct way. Stick together, like Dr. King was basically advocating, they can't defeat all of us. We're going to burn the tax office today at noon. That's not what they were doing. They were resisting in a different way. They were leaving threatening notes on the barn of the aristocrat in the hope that they would not be identified. And the Black Acts were imposing severe punishment for people who were found wearing a mask, i.e. found being anonymous. Yeah. Okay, so let me go back to and just do that small service to you of connecting this to Rousseau, because what I'm basically wanting you to think about as you're reading Rousseau, I'm putting it to you, Rousseau has a fundamentally different objective, because what he's talking, those other guys, Hobbes and Locke, could we say they're defending the status quo? They're advocating for the growth and peaceful, harmonious extension of property relations, relations among, no, equality. They do talk about equality. And equality is the central value which Rousseau is advocating for, freedom and equality. But he has a very special understanding of what freedom and equality mean. And how does that relate to the sweeping away of the ancien regime? How does it relate to the slogan of the French Revolution? Egalite, Fraternite, Liberte. Equality, brotherhood, and liberty. That slogan comes 40 years or 30 years, 30 years after the social contract. But I offer to you the idea that it's those values which are motivating the philosophy which Rousseau is putting forward. Flip it around, you might say, Rousseau motivates the humane radicalism of, or shall we call it the humanistic radicalism of the French Revolution. That's a very strong statement, and maybe historians wouldn't agree with it, but I'm putting it to you to consider as you're reading the social contract, that Rousseau is articulating the values of a radical egalitarianism, humane liberalism, and a commitment to the equality of all citizens. So it's a rejection of servility. It's a rejection of harsh exploitation. It's a rejection of the old regime, of the old property regime. It's not that he's anti-property, but what he's in favor of is the real, substantial moral equality of all citizens. And that puts real limits on inequality. If you take seriously all human beings, all citizens are moral equals, then suddenly that Chekhov character, or that Gogol character, who's striding around in his manor saying, you go and do such and so, you have to move out of that house. I have a cousin who's going to come and live in that house. In other words, just giving peremptory orders, taking stuff, commanding the lives of his serfs. That does not reflect moral equality of all citizens. So the old regime is, I would say, in Rousseauvian language, the old regime is fundamentally morally unacceptable because it is incompatible with the equality of all human beings, the genuine liberty of all human beings. And what is fraternity? That's an interesting question. I was going to say, I'm so happy we don't have them here, except we do. We just don't have houses. Houses is where all the bad stuff happens. But we do have houses, so don't we? They're just privately owned fraternities. Anyway, that's not what he's talking about. What is he talking about? Not he, but what do you think the slogan is talking about? Liberte, Egalite, Fraternite. What is it to admire and espouse the idea of brotherhood in society?
Well, it kind of fosters this mutual respect for one another, which obviously goes against the social ideals of the previous regime where there's that disparity. So
Good.
it kind of promotes equality.
Okay.
Society.
Good. So it's supportive of the other two values. It's got one other feature as well, though. Locke is quite insistent. You all, as members both of the state of nature and of civil society, have no mutual interests. Amber has no interest in Molly, aside from if Amber hires Molly to mow her grass, then they form a little contract or something. But there's no fundamental connection among citizens. Rousseau and the slogan of the French Revolution rejects that idea. It endorses the idea that citizens have a moral connection to one another, that the individual's connection to the society is a morally meaningful connection, as opposed to the liberal ideal, which both Hobbes and Locke are advocating. Remember, what I'm trying to motivate for you is, this is not Die Hard version 3, same movie, just running through slightly different characters. This is a fundamentally different movie that we're getting from Rousseau. He's arguing for a different conception of the relationship between the human being and the social order. And it's a powerful conception because it supports the idea that there's something about humanity, about being a human being, which means that fellow feeling and compassion and connection to others, that is an inherent part of being part of a civitas or being part of a civil society, that our relationships to others in society are not just instrumental. We are equals in the sense that we are equally entitled to pursue our own interests in our own way. We're equals rather in a moral sense. We are equal in stature, in status, in worthiness, in dignity. And therefore, that whole hat doffing thing, unacceptable. It's a crazy thing about the Soviet Union. I'm a huge non-fan of the Soviet Union, which of course doesn't exist anymore. But do you know what people were expected to say to each other? Would a working class person go to his boss and say, "Hey boss," or "Hey master," or "Tovarishch," or "Господин"? Those are the two terms that would be acceptable. Tovarishch is comrade, and Господин is citizen. That's interesting, isn't it? That these were the sanctioned terms of address among individuals in the Soviet Union. It's such a farce, to put forward the Soviet Union as in any way embodying liberty, equality, fraternity. But in this particular small way, it's an interesting fact that Soviet ideology was very much interested in defeating servility and defeating exploitation and putting it aside. All citizens are equal. So we are all Господин. We are all citizens together. We are all Tovarishch. I learned those words in my 1 year of Russian. I'm thinking of learning Russian again. Watch a bunch of YouTube and see if I can't learn enough Russian then to learn Ukrainian, because I'm planning to buy a small home in Ukraine. I have a feeling you'll need to speak Russian in Ukraine. Just a little joke. What do you think? Is it going to happen? Russia invading Ukraine? What's your feeling? How many think that by the end of the week, Russia will invade Ukraine?
You think so?
I do. I think Tuesday was the day I predicted. That's today. And the afternoon is getting long in Ukraine today, so it's not going to happen today. They're 6 hours ahead of us.
I feel like just because of that one time where I don't know, I remember reading it, like the US, there was a threat or something that
Yep.
they were going to, and then they never did anything about it.
Mhm.
Yeah, look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. Look how close that got.
Yeah,
Right.
I feel like Putin is a big showboater.
Yeah.
He likes to be like, I'm gonna do this, and then he creates chaos, and then he's like, I'm gonna go sleep for a couple years, and he comes back out and creates another
I
chaos.
think Marshall's pretty good.
I'm gonna say for sure.
So the cost is tremendous. And of course, the risk of war is tremendous. There was a piece of intelligence. They put up a bridge in the Crimea. And there was apparently solid intelligence that there were plans to destroy that bridge and blame it on the Ukrainians and then invade. Anyway, I'm still believing that there will be an invasion, but I think most Americans don't think so. And most Russians hope not. And I hope not too, because I hate the idea of bloodshed in Ukraine yet again. Okay, so what I ask you to do now is to read Rousseau with a new set of eyes and with a kind of a focus on old regime, old social relations, and what is he saying about the relationship between the citizen and the collectivity, the society, he calls it civil society. How is that different from Locke and Hobbes? That's what I was trying to set us up for today. And along the way, you got exposure to Tom Joad, E.P. Thompson, Vietnamese peasants. It's amazing the depth and all of your experience there today. Okay, bye. Yeah, thank you.
You're like Chandler, and I was like, maybe she's just.
Well, I learned something.